Now, let's turn our attention finally to the spinal nerve, which is what we see a schematic of on this diagram. So the first important point I want you to take from this is that of everything we see on this diagram, the only thing that is actually the spinal nerve is this, from here to there. That's the spinal nerve. It's very short. It's only about 1 centimeter long. So a spinal nerve starts where the two roots come together, and it ends where the two rami come apart. Ramus is the word for branch. So you have two branches or two rami. So from where the roots come together to where the rami come apart, that's the spinal nerve, nothing else. Okay? Now, we see that a spinal nerve is formed from two roots, a dorsal root and a ventral root. And I'm sure you recall that dorsal roots contain only sensory nerve fibers and ventral roots contain only motor nerve fibers. So let's look at them one at a time. So here's our sensory or dorsal root, containing sensory fibers. And along the length of that dorsal root, we see this enlargement, or the dorsal root ganglion. Now remember, the word ganglion has a very specific definition. A ganglion is a group of nerve cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. That's what a ganglion is, a group of nerve cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. That definition doesn't tell you anything more than that. It doesn't tell you what kind of nerves. It doesn't tell you if they're motor nerves or sensory nerves. It doesn't tell you if they're somatic nerves or autonomic nerves. And it certainly doesn't tell you whether anything is synapsing there or not. It just says there are cell bodies there. So this is a dorsal root ganglion. It contains cell bodies. Now, since all of these nerve fibers in the dorsal root are sensory nerve fibers, therefore these must be sensory cell bodies. So the dorsal root ganglion is a sensory ganglion. And as we will see, for all sensory ganglia in the body, there are no synapses in that ganglion. Nothing is happening there. There's no synapse. Nothing functional is really happening. It's just the place where the cell body lives. That's what the dorsal root ganglion is. Okay? If we look at the ventral root contains only motor fibers, and we do not see any enlargement along its length. There is no such thing as a ventral root ganglion. So the obvious question is, so where do the cell bodies of those nerve fibers live? And we see that the answer to that is they live here, inside the spinal cord, inside the gray matter of the spinal cord. So because these cell bodies are inside the spinal cord, which means they're in the central nervous system, you can't call it a ganglion, because ganglion means the cell body is in the peripheral nervous system. Here it's in the central nervous system. So a group of cell bodies in the central nervous system is called a nucleus. So because this nucleus is in the anterior horn of the gray matter, we call it an anterior horn nucleus. So that's where the cell bodies of the motor fibers are, in the gray matter of the spinal cord. Okay? Now, I do want to jump back for one moment to an issue of embryology. When we looked at the different kinds of embryonic cell types, and we talked about the kinds of ectoderm, we said that the ectoderm gets subdivided into neuroectoderm and neural crest ectoderm. If you go back and you look at that chart, you'll see that both neural ectoderm and neural crest ectoderm give rise to a variety of adult cell types, including nerve cells. They give rise to other things too, but they give rise to nerve cells. So both neural ectoderm and neural crest ectoderm gives rise to nerve cells. So that would mean that we would like a way to know for any given nerve cell, did it come from neural crest or did it come from neural ectoderm? And the way to answer that question is to simply look to find where is the cell body of that nerve cell. If the cell body is in the peripheral nervous system, as it is in this case for the dorsal root ganglion, right? Ganglion means it's in the periphery. So if the cell body is in the peripheral nervous system, in other words, in a ganglion, then that neuron came from neural crest, always. On the other hand, if the cell body of a neuron is in the central nervous system, anywhere in the central nervous system, brain or spinal cord, then that neuron came from neural ectoderm. Because neural ectoderm is what gives us the central nervous system. Okay, so the location of the cell body of a neuron is what will tell us whether it's a neural crest-derived neuron or a neural ectoderm-derived neuron. And as you'll see when you do neuroscience, there are some good reasons why you want to know that. Okay, so we now have dorsal roots with sensory neurons, ventral roots with motor neurons. We get finally to the spinal nerve where they merge, and so the spinal nerve has both motor and sensory. It's what we call a mixed nerve. And then the spinal nerve divides into two rami, or two branches, a dorsal ramus and a ventral ramus. And as is illustrated on this diagram, both motor and sensory fibers go into the ventral ramus, and both motor and sensory fibers go into the dorsal ramus. So both rami are mixed. So one obvious question is, why do we have two rami? If they both carry the same thing, why do we have two of them? And the answer is to go different places in the body. Ventral rami go more ventrally, and dorsal rami go more dorsally. But let's get a little more specific. When you look anatomically at an actual spinal nerve and look at the point where it branches into its two rami, you'll always find that the dorsal ramus is much smaller than the ventral ramus because it contains far fewer nerve fibers. So dorsal rami are small, ventral rami are large. What that is telling us is that dorsal rami don't innervate very many things, whereas ventral rami innervate lots of things. So it would make sense, if we want to know what they each innervate, is just learn what dorsal rami innervate, because there aren't very many things to learn that way. And then you'll know everything else is ventral ramus. So the things innervated by dorsal rami are, it's listed here, the skin of the back and the deep muscles of the back. There is a third thing not listed here, those zygapophyseal joints, but that's less important. The skin of the back and the deep muscles of the back. That's what dorsal rami innervate. Everything else that's innervated by spinal nerves get their innervation by way of ventral rami. So that would mean the lateral body wall, lateral chest wall, lateral abdominal wall, ventral body wall, chest, abdomen, upper limb, lower limbs, all of it is all ventral ramus. Okay. So that's the spinal nerve. Now, without having explicitly said so, what we really have been talking about is the somatic nervous system. And what I want to do now is turn our attention to the autonomic nervous system. Now, before I get into that, let me make one thing clear, because most people, when I ask the question, what's the difference between somatic versus autonomic, the answer that most people give is that one is voluntary, somatic, and the other is involuntary, autonomic. And that's not true. That's simply not true. The somatic nervous system sometimes operates voluntarily and sometimes involuntarily through reflexes. And similarly, the autonomic nervous system, although it often acts involuntarily, sometimes we can learn voluntary control of autonomic function as well. So the difference is not voluntary versus involuntary. So what is the difference? Well, there are several differences. First and most important is that the somatic nervous system innervates skeletal muscle, and only skeletal muscle. That's the only end organ that the somatic motor nervous system innervates, skeletal muscle. In contrast, the autonomic system never innervates skeletal muscle. What it innervates is smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. That's the difference. So sometimes skeletal muscles are operating voluntarily and sometimes involuntarily by reflexes, but either way, the innervation is somatic. And similarly, smooth muscle, glands, and so forth usually operate involuntarily by reflexes, but sometimes there is voluntary control that can be learned. So the key definitional difference between somatic and autonomic is what the end organ is that's being innervated. Skeletal muscle for somatic, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands for autonomic. Now, there is also a difference in the pathway that these motor neurons take to get to their end organs. The somatic nervous system has what we call a one-neuron pathway, meaning that from the central nervous system to the end organ is a skeletal muscle. from the CNS, whether it be brain or spinal cord, to that skeletal muscle, it's one neuron that goes the entire distance, no matter how far that skeletal muscle cell is from the CNS. In the case of the autonomic nervous system, we have a two-neuron pathway. Again, counting from the central nervous system out to the end organ, it's two neurons, where the first neuron innervates the second neuron, and then the second neuron innervates the end organ. In the case of the somatic nervous system, that one neuron that's in the pathway has its cell body in the central nervous system. It might be in the brain, it might be in the spinal cord, but it's in the central nervous system. In the case of the autonomic nervous system, the first neuron has its cell body in the central nervous system. Again, it could be brain or it could be spinal cord, but it's in the central nervous system. But the second neuron is not in the central nervous system. The second neuron will always be in the peripheral nervous system. In other words, it will be in a ganglion. So this is a different kind of ganglion, not like a dorsal root ganglion. This is a motor or an autonomic ganglion. The cell body of the second neuron is in the peripheral nervous system in a ganglion. And then going back to what we said earlier about embryology, since for the somatics we said that one neuron has its cell body in the central nervous system, that means that is a neuron that is derived from neural ectoderm, because any neuron that has its cell body in the CNS is from neural ectoderm. And in contrast, the autonomic nervous system, the first neuron is from neural ectoderm, because its cell body is in the CNS, but the second neuron is in neural crest, because its cell body is in the peripheral nervous system. Okay? So let's see what that means. So here's a schematic of a somatic motor neuron. Here's its cell body, someplace in the central nervous system. Might be brainstem, might be spinal cord. It's in the central nervous system. And then its axon goes from there all the way out through the peripheral nervous system until it finally gets to the end organ, which would be a skeletal muscle cell. That would be over here.